So this week I want to talk to you about cultural capital. Last week I was doing some mooching through my Twitter timeline and I saw a post from Ofsted. What Ofsted were saying was that they were using cultural capital, which is a term that's widely used in sociology, to inform some of their practice with early years. Now, the link contained a video to a kind of talking headpiece by a lady called Wendy Ratcliffe, who is Her Majesty's Inspector for Early Years within Ofsted. Now, this post kicked off a bit of a Twitter frenzy, low level Twitter frenzy, more of like a Twitter gust than a Twitter storm. Essentially, there were an awful lot of academic researchers and sociologists who appeared to take umbrage with the fact that Ofsted were using cultural capital in this way. So I had a little watch of the video. And what I found was it annoyed me too. So what I did, had a little bit of a sarcastic moan about it. But after that, I did some reflecting on why it had caused this Twitter gust and what people might need to be aware of if terminology around cultural capital is being used. So that's the purpose of this video. We're going to dig a little bit into cultural capital in the way that it's used in sociology, and then we're going to take a look at the way that the Ofsted early years team have decided to use the phrase and explore in a little bit more depth why people might have got a little bit annoyed that Ofsted are using it in the way that they are. So right, first of all, cultural capital. Cultural capital is a term that's quite widely used in sociology and in a lot of educational research, and the way that it is usually used and described is within a research framework or a theoretical framework that was put together by a gentleman called Pierre Bourdieu. What Bourdieu said was there was three different forms of capital that we as individuals in society had varying degrees of access to, and cultural capital was one of these. So Bourdieu said that there was social capital, which involved the people that you knew and the networks that you were part of. The second one, there was economic capital, and that involved the amount of monetary assets that you might have access to, not just in terms of disposable income, but things like, wealth through property and those types of things. The third one was this idea of cultural capital. And what Bourdieu did with cultural capital is he split it down into three types and said cultural capital could either be objectified cultural capital, so it could be things like having access to books that were written by Shakespeare in the home. It could be things like having a dedicated room or a study space to conduct your work in, and a whole host of others besides. But the objectified cultural capital was tangible things, essentially. The second one was embodied cultural capital, and embodied cultural capital consists of the way that you might carry yourself, the way that you walk, the way that you speak, so the accent that you have, and the way that you act in certain social situations, which receive a varying degree of acceptance depending on which particular environment you might reside in. If I give you the example of going to a football match, I've been going to football games since I was quite young, and actually if I go to my local team, which is Wolverhampton Wanderers, and I sit in the stand and they're singing the songs and having a few choice words for the referee, then that's something I can quite happily be involved in, engaged with. It doesn't require me to think too much about how I'm expected to act in those types of environments. However, if I was an individual that had never been to a football match and had perhaps only ever been to Wimbledon, for instance, to get my live sporting fix, then all of a sudden, if I was in that environment, I wouldn't quite know what to do with myself. I wouldn't necessarily know the most legitimate way to act in those particular environments, how to get along with the singing, when to shout at the referee or the player, when not to, when to turn to the bloke next to me and have a chat about a decision that's just been made for a free kick. That would all be completely alien to me. So embodied cultural capital is contextual as well, right? It depends on the environment that you're in. And the third one, institutionalized cultural capital is what Bourdieu said, and essentially this was the qualifications or the credentials that could be bestowed by institutions. So things like GCSE results, A-level results, degrees, Chartered Institute of Marketing qualifications, accountancy qualifications with the ACCA. All of that would count as institutionalised cultural capital. Now, social, economic and cultural capital were all things that Bourdieu argued we had varying degree of access to, and the different types that we had would be of particular value in different social situations, in different fields. Social fields is what Bourdieu called them. And this combination of capitals that we had made up our habitus, which was essentially an embodied bank of these resources which we drew on unconsciously in particular social conditions. Now, when Bourdieu was coming up with this theoretical framework and his reason for devising this framework that could explain kind of the world around us and how individuals act in particular social circumstances, was to uncover mechanisms of social reproduction of things like inequality that perhaps wouldn't otherwise be observable, which might remain hidden through overt means, so things like government policies that detrimentally affected people with less access to certain capitals over other forms. Essentially, what Bourdieu was interested in is how reproduction of inequality or social advantage worked in society. So that is a very, very superficial, very, very short version of what Bourdieu might mean by capital, and how it entwines and relates to all of these different other conceptual tools that he's got that provide a mechanism whereby we might be able to understand the social world that we live in a little bit better. Now, let's take a look at Ofsted, shall we? And have a look at their definition of cultural capital. So I've pulled up one of their slides here, which was on the video. As you can see, what Ofsted describe as cultural capital is essentially knowledge and skills that they believe are the appropriate ones for young people to have in order for them to progress educationally and achieve a fulfilling life afterwards. And that's absolutely fine if Ofsted want people to have these knowledge and skills and that's what they're going to work on. Brilliant, no problem with that. What people took umbrage with was the fact that Ofsted were appropriating a term which is loaded with sociological meaning, loaded with complexity, is the subject of much debate within academia itself, and essentially narrowing it down to knowledge and experience. If it was the case that cultural capital was just that, and free-floating of any of the other things that I'd spoken about, any of those concepts like habitus, like field, like the other forms of capital and how they converse and are in dialogue with the social environments that they're in, then fair enough. But it doesn't, and you cannot use cultural capital purely to describe knowledge and skills. What that does is narrows down the terminology so much that essentially it makes it largely ineffective as a tool and presents cultural capital as something that could be taken up by policymakers, by people who are working within those types of media, government environments that might not have an understanding of the complexity of the terminology and its uses and what it actually means. And what would probably be a sociologist's worst nightmare is if that term was hijacked and it was used for something which, instead of uncovering the hidden mechanisms of power and reproduction, was instead a term that was used to bash people that were experiencing inequality with, to once again in education say that these people are lacking cultural capital and that actually that makes them less worthwhile than people who had appropriate cultural capital. In sociological research, and when we're talking about capital, the idea that someone has no capital or no valuable capital isn't a thing. They might have different forms of capital that are appropriate in different social situations, like I gave the example, for instance, of the football match, but they certainly don't lack anything of value just because they might not have capital which are appropriate, or as Bourdieu might say, hold symbolic value for certain trajectories. If you remove that nuance and you don't take those things into account when you're talking about capital, and you might be allowing it to become appropriated by individuals who would misuse that term for essentially inappropriate ends within social research. When we're looking at education, then it's through an angle a lot of the time of social justice, of wanting to level the playing field. Ofsted's use of the term firstly was inaccurate given that wider context we've just spoken about, and secondly really runs the risk of allowing other people to pick it up and use it for purposes that aren't aligned to equality or social justice. And that's why I took more than slight issue with it, and why I gave a bit of a sarky tweet about it. I think it's something that we all need to be aware of within educational policy discourse, within media representations of disadvantaged or working class students, because through the misuse of terminology like this, we might be entering a situation where we're doing more harm than good, and none of us want that. And we all want to be working towards ends that are the best possible outcomes for these young people that we're engaging with. So please, Ofsted, if you're doing your early years framework and you want to equip these students with appropriate knowledge and skills towards particular trajectories, that's fine. Just call them knowledge and skills rather than cultural capital, because cultural capital means something completely different, and it is a lot more complex than you're giving it credit for. And you've made a load of academics grumpy, which is never good for you because you get abuse on Twitter. Okay, anyway, that's that bit of that rant over from me. I hope I've managed to contextualise that a little bit for you, and hopefully you feel a little bit more armed yourself now to be aware and beware of cultural capital and its use in the media and by Ofsted when it comes around, and hopefully also appreciate why people might get a little bit more miffed about it. So I'll leave it there for this week. That's it from me.